Hello everyone. We are continuing with our Let's Talk Europe episodes, and today we have a special guest from Poland. As I have checked the Wikipedia, it says that's a Polish social entrepreneur, civic activist, and academic, but also a founder of so many organizations. I want to mention just a few. So probably a founder and chairwoman of Warsaw Security Forum, and founder of European Academy of Diplomacy in Warsaw. So a great person to talk about the geopolitical changes in Europe. So hello, Katarzyna.
Hi, hello, Jussis. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. So as we have talked, there are a few topics that we want to discuss with you, and maybe let's start. Even today, I have seen that Kuleba, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Ukraine, announces that there are some disappointing signals coming from Germany, and maybe that's the first point of our chat. What are the the German and French positions in terms of this Russian aggression and this war in Ukraine that are changing or not changing so rapidly? I mean, they are not changing at all. Somebody could say, what are the reasons behind this stubbornness of main old Europe countries to understand that we need to finish this war in Ukraine as quickly as possible, and probably the only force that can finish this is Ukrainian military?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, I would definitely differentiate and not put in one bag both Germany and France, because these countries, although we tend to have this image of having the same stance on Russia, they have definitely gone through a completely different road and transformation. So I would say that the transformation in France is, at the end of the day, on the societal level, much smaller than the one happening in Germany. So France has always had a very kind of, I would say, practical approach to Russia. It has always seen Russia as a partner for dialogue, and it always believed in kind of this continuous dialogue. Of course, the French have been very strong both in supporting sanctions and denouncing the many war crimes of Russia. But again, I don't see a very, very deep change in the society of France overall. And I do see that change in the German society. This change has not been reflected fully for the elites. It has not been reflected fully in terms of the political establishment, especially SPD, the ruling party at the moment. But we can see that the society itself has changed its approach to Russia, and that in the long term will be reflected in politics. So I think we're in a
Katarzyna, how is it possible that the widespread public sympathy for Ukraine in Germany, which is even supported by the other coalition partners, I mean the Liberal Frees and the Democrats and the Greens, how is it possible that this social democrat party, in Germany, they don't appreciate their voters?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it only shows the incredible effectiveness of Russia to capture German elites. And we're talking here not only about political elites, but business elites, the kind of intertwining of the many people who today, although are not in a majority in Germany, make those political decisions. And it turns out it's extremely difficult to unwind itself from these Russian influences. Again, we have to also make that differentiation. When you look at the current coalition government, when you look at the Greens, they're saying something completely different than many people with the SPD. So, but again, because some of these elites, especially the SPD elites, but not only, also CDU, have been very strongly influenced by Russian business links, by Russian Russian political links. Sometimes many of them might still be under, different type of influence that they have little control over. So I think this is a very slow process, and Russia has put all its weapons, and it has, as we know, not only military, not only economic, but it also has human inside of these societies, and especially when it comes to decision makers. So again, I think it's a slow process, but I am at the end of the day hopeful that the tide has changed, that although we are very frustrated, especially you in Lithuania, us in Poland, with the speed of the change, we're very frustrated with the lack of deliveries of military equipment, specifically from Germany. We're very disappointed with this kind of slow understanding of the threat that Russia poses. I think at the end of the day, the Germans see the change as a revolutionary change that is happening right now, and there is no way back to the business as usual with Russia in Germany, much more than it is, I would say, in France. I hope not. I hope I'm wrong, that the French have also learned its lesson. But again, I think that the change in Germany that is happening is going to be for the long term really permanent and revolutionary.
So we could say that those phone calls, long phone calls from French president is kind of a mirror of the society and what they think, in good relationship with Russia, no matter what. What can change the French, the opinion of the public in terms of this war?
I think we can, again, a lot of French society has shown and is showing continuous support for this humanitarian effort to help Ukraine. Yes, so in terms of understanding who is the perpetrator, who's the invader, and who's the victim, that is very clear. But at the same time, there is this, for us, completely difficult to understand drive to engage Russia no matter what. So seeing Russia as an important security actor, which it is, of course, in Europe, but one that you can only have impact on, influence on, if you engage with Russia in permanent dialogue, yes, and permanent diplomatic dialogue. I've been to Paris a few weeks ago and had several meetings with the French MFA, and I was pretty astonished by the fact that everyone there was, number one, very tired with the war. I even felt like they would be fighting the wars themselves.
So you mean they are longing for business as usual?
They were longing for peace, as they said, and they of course understood that there is no place and no space for peace talks. And this is mainly because none of the parties, neither the Russians or the Ukrainians, want these peace talks to succeed. They still, both parties, as we see, have an understanding that first you have to have a strong military victory, whatever that victory for each side means, to be in a better negotiating position. So the French understood that, the MFA understands that there is no space for these peace talks, but at the same time, they are longing for them. Yes, the understanding for at that time, a few weeks ago, the hope that the Ukrainians actually could take over any more territory, take back territory was close to zero. So again, I think that a lot of the French political elites are quite detached from what's really happening in Ukraine, and detached from the understanding that Russia does not really believe in dialogue. It only believes in sheer force. And if you don't put it in a very difficult military position, no negotiations would start. I can only hope that the last few days have proven the French very wrong in their assessment, and maybe there will be some change also of attitudes. But what we've seen over the last few months, I think, can and did disappoint many in our region. But having said that, we also have to stress that both Germany and France have been behind the toughest sanctions the world has ever seen against Russia. without their not only consent, but drive the economic sanctions that the EU has imposed. Now, the visa sanctions that we want to impose and many other sanctions in place simply would not happen. So although, again, we're very critical, and I think rightly so, when it comes to military support for Ukraine, we have to remember that these countries at the end of the day, and in comparison to many other countries around the world, have been, steadfast in supporting Ukraine and, being at the end of the day at the right side of history. But of course, we should expect from such big countries in Europe much more.
Before I go to the sanction topic, I want to ask on the final thing on could it be like that the French and the German elites, and their opposition is just some kind of, cynical stand because US and UK position is different, and since historically they tend to have their own politics, and views, they just want to be a different different point and different viewpoint that they are presenting. Could it be that, or it's
You're
much
asking
more...
only about the French or both Germans and French?
Both.
So for Germans, the British factor here, is important, but not in the way that they would do something that opposes what the Brits do. On the contrary, the Germans have a tendency actually to look at the Brits as, and as a potential inspiration. They trust many of the foreign policy, calls and the kind of security assessment of Great Britain. And the situation, of course, is completely different in France. The French have a very long history, as we know, of relations with the United Kingdom, which, although are friendly in general, because we are all in a united Europe, although the UK is no longer an EU member state, then of course they are very skeptical sometimes of British foreign policy, have a tendency to criticize what the British do and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I don't think that their policy towards Ukraine, and more important, their policy towards Russia, is determined by what the Brits do. I don't think they're doing it, because the Brits are doing something else, we'll do something else. No, that's not the case. We have to remember about the internal politics of France. We have a party, Le Front National, with Marine Le Pen, which has over 30, maybe even up to 40% of possible voters in France. And this is a political party that is extremely pro-Russian. It's a political party which would want to see, a big, almost unification and forgetting about what Russia is and has been doing in Ukraine. I just remind you that Marine Le Pen herself, not long ago, a few months ago, just before the war, said that in her opinion, Crimea is and always has been Russian, and she cannot, imagine that the Russians could give back Crimea to Ukraine. So, and of course, we know that her party has been financed by a Russian bank. Her campaign has been supported by Russia. So all that is an important factor when you look at Emmanuel Macron's policy. He understands that, of course, although the Russian question is not the main question in domestic French policy, he understands that she has a lot of supporters, that if he goes too far in many policies, that he might lose voters and Marine Le Pen might gain them. So it's mainly a domestic fight for votes. It's a domestic fight for influence. Luckily, we have just concluded the election season in France with Emmanuel Macron receiving the majority of votes and again becoming president, but losing a lot of members in the parliament and losing influence within the Assemblée Générale. So that surely weakens his position. And again, these domestic factors, much more than what the United Kingdom does, affect the French politics and the politics of Emmanuel Macron.
Well, we should probably mention that not only Le Pen, but the party and the and the leader who took the third place, and there are even more, left-wing parties that also have this
Absolutely.
sympathy.
Méchalon, as you said, has also had a stance that has been criticized as undermining Ukrainian right to choose what they want, whether they want to fight. So again, we have Emmanuel Macron, who at the end of the day is the best option out of all options currently available. And I think we should also appreciate that this might not be the case always. At the same time, in Germany, most parties at the end of the day are in the mainstream when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Even if we criticize the SPD for being very slow on arms deliveries, it's clear that this is a party that has supported the sanctions and has seen, the events as a kind of wake-up call. The only party that's clearly pro-Russian, the Alternative für Deutschland, in the recent polls, does not score more than 10%, even less.
Well, they also have the Der Linke in Germany, which is
yes, the left is Der Linke. That's also, but we're talking altogether by around 10%, maybe 12% of voters, and that is not a significant amount of voters. Again, the majority of the society supports a continuous help for Ukraine. There's a very interesting recent poll, actually, done in Germany, which shows that over 60% of people say that they're willing to pay a significant financial price, also in energy, in order to continue support for Ukraine. So that tells you something about the moods. But again, as we said before, it does not necessarily reflect yet the full change within the political elite.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you read the articles of the German elite and their statements. So does this all mean that there could be a push for some diplomatic solution regarding, the war in Ukraine? We see that, the Ukrainians, they are not satisfied, and the Russian conditions for any peace talks are just ridiculous. Do you think that during the upcoming months, once it gets colder, and as the narrative from Russia says, the Europe will crack, which we probably doubt here in Europe, that there could be a larger, and stronger push towards some diplomatic solution of this war?
Well, the push for diplomatic solutions can really come from three sides. I always tell that to our French and German partners, that it's not up to us to decide who and when is going to sit at the diplomatic table. It's not going to be France, it's not going to be Germany, it's kind of going to be Poland or even Lithuania that will have any say in when the sides will sit and talk. Yes, we may ask, we may encourage, we may want, but we have at the end of the day nothing to say here. There's only three parties that have something to say: the Ukrainians, if they want to fight, how far, how long, and what kind of sacrifices they're willing to take. And we've seen that they are willing to take a lot of sacrifices and they're not done, far from. The Russians, how much can the regime withstand and whether it's going to back. And the last, Americans. Why Americans? Because Americans are the main providers of weapons. If the American administration, God forbid, would change and there would be a decision to stop military assistance to Ukraine, well, that would put the type of pressure that Ukraine would have to, reconsider. But thank God, I don't think we're seeing, any such threat anytime soon. Definitely not this winter, and definitely not in the spring. So I think we're safe here. So again, there's only three actors who will make that decision. That is going to be, at the end of the day, Ukraine, Russia, or the United States. And if there's going to be any honest broker in all this, we've seen that Turkey so far has taken the lead. And again, it's not Europe, it's not the European Union who will be helping to make these settlements. It will be, it will be these countries concerned themselves with, if any, help of Turkey. But I think we're still very far from that. And the last counteroffensive has shown that there's still a lot of place for the Ukrainians to prepare for good negotiations, which at the end of the day, we know will have to happen one way or the other. But again, there's no appetite on either side for this now.
Do you think that the elections in US have any kind of threat to the current status quo, in terms of US support?
Yeah, so all of my friends in the States, both on the Republican and Democratic parties, tell me that whoever wins the elections to the House of Representatives and the Senate, it doesn't really matter when it comes to Ukraine, because both the House and the Senate will continue its support for Ukraine. And I hope that's true, and I believe that this is going to be the case. But at the same time, I'm also very vividly aware of the fact that within the Republican Party, there is a growing movement around, unfortunately, former President Donald Trump, that represent the views of Carl Tuckerson from Fox News, which are very often pro-Russian or spreading Russian propaganda. And we've seen a few of these new members of congressmen coming in with really shocking, as for America views. And I do fear that this election, upcoming primaries, will see many of those more radical voices who will be asking questions. Why is America supporting Ukraine? Why are we spending our taxpayer money in a faraway land? Why can't we just find some solution with Russia? We should focus on China. Yes, Russia should be our ally fighting with China. We can't push Russia into Chinese hands. We will hear those voices, and unfortunately they will be coming from the far right within the Republican Party primarily, but also from the far left. Let's say there are those as well within the Democratic Party. So everything depends on how polarization will further benefit the fringes of these parties. If the more radical voices come into the Congress, then at some point that balance will shift against Ukraine. But I don't see the threat of this happening in this election. Maybe in 2 years, if things go really bad, but this time around, I'm pretty confident that, again, even if the Republicans take over the House, take over the Senate, that policy of support of Ukraine will continue.
Well, sadly, not only Tucker Carlson, is spreading this propaganda. To be honest, everyone who is following Republican media in the States, I guess, can feel sometimes the shame, that of the information that is coming from there. But I want to ask about this narrative that sanctions will not break Russia. I hear this from the U.S. Media as well, that Russia is will persist this, and they can go for longer, last for longer. What do you think about this narrative, and what is the effect of the sanctions towards the Russian society? Of course, there is another narrative that Russian society is unbreakable because all that they need is vodka and maybe, I don't know, cabbages. But what do you think?
Well, I think the narrative that sanctions don't work is completely untrue. What we have seen so far is, an environment in which the regime in Russia is still able to profit from the largest of its income sources, which is oil and gas. And what we've seen over the last few months was that, of course, because of the increase of oil prices, gas prices, as a consequence of the war, the treasury of Russia has been gaining incredible amounts of money. And this was the main argument to say, well, sanctions are not working. Actually, Russia is receiving more money from selling natural resources than before the war. But that narrative has effectively ended last month and this month. What we're seeing is as was predicted by many experts, we are seeing a very quick decrease in revenues to the Russian budget because in the first shock the prices were very high and everybody was trying to buy as much from Russia to prepare for the winter. But now, as we see, we're better and better prepared for the winter. Countries stop buying. At the same time, prices go down. And that is where the revenue is breaking. And it turns out that with the current costs that Russia, estimated costs, because we don't have full numbers, but the estimated cost of this war for Russia, it seems that the coffers and the budget will be emptied by the end of this year. Russia is not able to withstand, a long-term policy of sanctions, having, the type of cost it has right now for this war. So what does that tell us? It tells us first and foremost that the pressure will come from the elites, because as we know, Russian elites don't really care about the people. And they also believe, as you said, that an average Russian will survive, somehow on cabbage and vodka. But at the same time, they care about their own well-being. If they can no longer travel to Europe, if their yachts have been seized, if they can't fly to their villas in Italy or Spain, well, then at least they have to have some money in Moscow to live off. And a complete collapse, financial collapse of Russia will hit them first and foremost. So I think the pressure is going to come from the richer Russians at the end, which have been disproportionately benefiting from this oil and gas El Dorado that Russia has been on for many, many years, if not decades. That's number one. Second, of course, the Russian people will feel the pressure of the sanctions. They already do. They felt it in 2014, where, for example, food prices went up 24%. But they went up because of Russia's counter sanctions on the EU. Yes, not EU's sanctions. So Putin knew that, the people will survive this and they'll find a way, to move forward. But I think, the Russian society, although can withstand a lot of things, is not unbreakable. And yes, the rise of prices and the decrease of living conditions will hit, that's for sure. But I think what the Kremlin is even more afraid of is that at some point it will not be able to continue to wage this war without full mobilization of the Russian people. And that would be breaking a specific pact that Putin has with the Russian people, which is the following. I give you the pride of being the superpower who takes over Crimea and Ukraine, but you don't protest politically. Yes, I give you the dignity that you were lacking for many years, but you don't protest. And the Russians were okay with this as long as it did not affect them directly, especially in terms of potential mobilization of forces, conscripts and so on and so forth. And if this changes, I think this is what the Kremlin is afraid the most, that this will actually wage protests. And my last point is that what we've seen over the last few days is that those who started to protest the most are not anti-war figures, but pro-war figures. They are the most unhappy right now with Russian policy, not because it waged the war in Ukraine, but because it's losing the war in Ukraine.
But that's about 10% probably of population.
It is, but it's a radical 10%, which is allowed to speak out. And that radicalism, as usually with radicalism, spreads. So this is a real, I think, consideration and threat for the regime. What happens if these voices of dissent are voices that are calling for more because they have been prepared for a large victory, which is not delivered. So they question, why have we sacrificed so much? Why are we sacrificing so much if the victory is not delivered? So this is another layer, another issue that should be taken into consideration in the weeks and months to come.
So can we already be starting, some kind of conversation, future of Russia after Putin, because probably most of the, Europeans think that sooner or later Russia is going to collapse the way it is now. What do you think the future holds for Russia?
Well, I'm not very optimistic, to tell you the truth. I think that I'm sure it's not going to be another 1991. So when we're going to see, a kind of huge disappointment with the Soviet system as it was in 1991, a kind of opening to democracy, to free market, and so on. I think if the regime collapses and if Putin is dead or disappears, we don't know. What we're going to see is probably more of the same, but with the different face. I don't think Russian nationalism and imperialism is going anywhere. I think the society has been breeded, and in that sense is a broken society. And it's going to be extremely difficult first for any new leader to explain what happened in Ukraine. Why did we not succeed? Why did we fail? So in order to keep and grasp power, it's not telling the truth is not going to do the trick. You will probably have to say more of the same, that Russia has been hurt. This was a big scheme of the West and NATO, which has, armed Ukraine and prepared this for many years. And this was an attack on Russia. So, again, I'm not very optimistic unless the war is a complete disaster for Russia. So, for example, Crimea is taken. Yes. Which actually means that Putin's policy that he has began in 2014 goes completely bankrupt. Maybe, and only maybe then, will there be some kind of a reflection, yes? But I'm afraid that anything in between, any peace settlement where, Crimea stays with Russia, there's some, territory in Donbass, so we're going back pre the 24th of February, is going to only make things worse over the long term. Yes. So
you don't believe in this disintegration of Russia, and ethnic groups that could push for some kind of sovereignty?
I would want to believe in that, but I don't see any movement of any groups here altogether. So even if you look at Tatarstan, even if you look at Buryatia, I've been many years ago to Buryatia, and I know the region pretty well. The society has been heavily Russianized, if you know what I mean. They feel as citizens of the Russian Federation. As they are, and even the Chechens. If I would see any secession anywhere in the future, that would be in the Southern Caucasus. But at the moment, under Kadyrov and the type of synergy that's happening between the Russian regime and Northern Caucasus, I don't see a possibility of a large-scale disintegration. I would love to be wrong. I would love somebody to prove me wrong. But again, I don't see this happening anytime soon. And I think it would be also counterproductive for us to assume this. Because, for countries such as Poland or Lithuania, this is the best case scenario, yes? Because that definitely weakens Russian imperialism for decades to come. But if you make that assumption, you become hopeful for a scenario that is unlikely, and you don't take preventive actions for the scenario that's probably the most probable, so that Russia will remain as it is in terms of both territorial space, but also politics. And the big question is, what do we do with such a Russia? Yes, what do we do with a revanchist Russia? I think that is the problem that we still face, and we don't have a clear answer. But for now, the most important is to prove this policy of Putin bankrupt, fully bankrupt, including, taking back by the Ukrainians of Crimea. And only then can we start thinking, what do we do with Russia? What do we do with Russian society? Yes, which is going to be, devastated, but not broken, if you know what I mean. This is not going to be Nazi Germany in 1945, which, by the way, in 1945, Nazi Germany, the majority of Germans still supported Hitler after his death. We need to understand that. So it was a huge program of re-education of Germans done throughout many, many decades. So this is not going to happen in Russia. We're going to have a society that is going to be difficult to deal with, is going to be further hurt. And again, unless there's some big revolution from within, it's not going to be an easy task to deter and contain the next regime after Putin.
Why are you so skeptical about the retaking of Crimea, from what I understood, or am I wrong? Because from what we see, this is not something unimaginable. If we take in consideration the condition of a Russian army that is in the territory of Ukraine, and as you said, the conscripts doesn't work, mobilization is not functioning, so Crimea seems like low-hanging fruit.
Well, I think that's over optimistic, a low hanging fruit. I think, the Ukrainian army would not even say Kherson is a low hanging fruit. It's a very complicated military option.
I mean, after the Lend-Lease starts, things might be a bit easier.
Well, I think I'm not saying it's impossible. I say it's desirable, taking over Crimea, but I say also it's going to be the most difficult. Why? Because at this point of time, Putin cannot allow it himself to lose Crimea. If he loses Crimea, he loses everything. He loses his life, he loses power.
So you mean escalation might be on the table?
Yes, absolutely. So although the propaganda can explain, well, Kharkiv region was never of our interest, we just had a forward moving operation, then the fact we lost these territories, Izum and so on, this is not a problem because we were fighting for Donbass, and and Crimea is protecting people in Donbass, and Crimea, of course, which is our territory. This is what is important. They can even explain if they lose Kherson. Yes, they can still, say, well, this was a forward moving mission, but we just wanted to make sure we are protecting Crimea, but now we have that under control, so we can go back to Crimea. I can imagine the propaganda spinning things around as much, but the propaganda cannot spin around losing Crimea because it has become a myth, a national myth of 2014, Krym nasz. Yes. So Putin has built the last decade on the presumption, well, there's not going to be, any more economic growth, but look, we've just took over Crimea and it's again ours. Crimea is ours. So the moment he loses that, he loses legitimacy as a leader altogether across the spectrum. And that's why I think that, Crimea altogether, if there is no change in the Kremlin anytime soon, is going to be the space where potential escalation happens. And I also can imagine the Russians saying, well, if you enter Crimea, we use tactical nuclear weapons because this is Russian territory. That, officially, according to us, yes. So it's more complicated. Again, we've seen a lot of twists and turns in this war. So many things can still happen, but I think, Crimea is a cherry on the cake. Let's first make sure the cake is there, and the cake is Kherson. It's getting back parts of Donbass, at least those parts that you
mean moving back to February 24 line? Exactly,
to that line. That will be already an incredible defeat for the Russians. Yes?
Okay, so but let's look at the last small topic. We see, the measures that Poland is taking in terms of military, additional weaponry, is bought, and the reorganization and stuff like that. Do you think that it's possible that as a closest ally, Poland can supply and provide enough weapons, and turn this conflict around?
I would love to say yes, but we, as most of European countries, are reaching the limits of what we simply have in our stocks. We are, of course, buying a huge amount of weaponry from our American and Korean friends. We have speeded up many contracts. We are waiting for Abrams tanks, where we're also planning to give the old Soviet tanks to Ukraine. But in comparison to actors such as the United States, I mean, we have limited capacity, just like Lithuania. Of course, we have
Well, it's
maybe
much
more
different.
capacity. Yeah, I know, of course. But you have to remember that, you know, we've been there at the forefront of countries who were declaring and immediately delivering. Basically, everything we declared that we can give was immediately delivered. I'm sure that there is more things we can still provide Ukraine with, but at the end of the day, again, we were not prepared for such a large-scale war. And having in mind that we also have to have some military equipment, not only to protect ourselves, but also to protect other NATO countries, like the Baltic states, for example, we have to be very realistic. So what is important in the long term, of course, that Ukraine not only receives the funding, you know, the Lend-Lease funding for military equipment, so it can also produce at least its own ammunition, but buy it on the markets. There is no shortage of ammunition in the world. I can promise you that, but you just have to buy it from countries that you have not considered so far. But at the same time, we need to you know, look at new ways of approaching, you know, military aid to Ukraine, because again, everywhere I go in Europe, every general and every army member tells me the same things. We're simply running out of stocks. We've given as much as we could from our reserves, but you know, this is not sustainable for
Katarzyna, I want to make a small remark here. Everybody is like, who is like a war analyst, say that aviation could be a game changer, and since, you know, Europe was never preparing for artillery war, NATO main strength was always, you know, the aviation. If Ukraine receives, you know, F-16s or any other, you know, US or European planes, that might be the tipping point.
Well, it might, that's true. And as far as I know, we're already training Ukrainians to have that ability to fly. I mean, they're already flying MiGs, but it's about the F-16s, F-14s, and so on. So that is already happening. But you have to remember for that, what is the most important is, of course, the air missile defense systems. And as we saw, and you know, earth surface to earth to sky missiles. So what we're seeing, this is what we saw with HIMARS, how that has changed really the situation on the front. And that has been provided by the Americans. I remind you that Poland has currently 2 Patriot batteries on its soil. And both of these batteries have been brought by the Americans at the beginning of this war to protect their own bases in Poland. So basically our sky has been unprotected before the 24th of February. Not of
well,
course,
that's probably
counting,
in terms of long range artillery. The medium range you absolutely have in Poland.
To the extent, yes, we have our own system, but we're talking about long range. This is what we're you know, fearful of at the moment. So again, I think we've learned our lessons. You know, we're speeding up. I do hope that the deliveries of equipment into Poland, military equipment, will release at least some of the old equipment that we could give to Ukraine. That will surely happen with the next batch of tanks. But again, I think there has to be a collective response like we have in Ramstein, of thinking, you know, who can do what and how in the long term we can support the military effort of Ukraine.
So just to finalize, we should be preparing for a longer conflict, and you know, it's not gonna be finished by the end of this year.
Well, do you believe it will?
Well, I'm an optimist, so you know, I do, but as you said, it depends, you know, on the military equipment that is there in Ukraine.
Well, I think the last week has made us all very hopeful. it showed the incredible ability of the Ukrainian army to mobilize and take over very speedily territory, but it also showed the complete demoralization of Russian army and its soldiers. So there's something happening there as well. We are hearing today that there has been movements from Crimea of families of soldiers and soldiers. That's a very interesting question. What does that mean? But I think it would be unrealistic to expect that Russia, or maybe naive to expect that Russia will not respond with full force. What that full force is, we will see in the upcoming days. Let's hope it's nothing.
Well, then
that means Russia has lost the war, and your optimism, yeah, and then your optimism is well founded. But if it does escalate in whatever manner it can, then of course we might have to prepare for a long winter and a war, which of course cannot continue indefinitely. But the hot phase will definitely be with us for the next months to come.
Katarzyna, I want to thank you so much for your time. We know that your agenda is strict, so well, there would be quite a lot of questions, but let's finish here, because as I mentioned, the time is running out. So it was a pleasure. I hope it's not the last time we can have a chat with you.
I'll be very happy to be back. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Yossi, for the invitation.
And thanks everyone for watching, and see you in the next Let's Talk Europe episode.